Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for joining us at this crucial juncture in the COP29 climate negotiations. My name is Tom Boyle. I'm Head of Global Partnerships with the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. On the panel today, we have Harjeet Singh, Global Engagement Director with the Fossil Fuel Treaty. We have Thato Gabaitse, a climate justice activist from Botswana. We have Joseph Sikulu, 350 Org Pacific Managing Director and with the Pacific Climate Warriors, and Ayshka Najib, a climate justice activist from Fridays for Future, MAPA. We're meeting here today in Baku at a time when the stakes could not be higher. Across the globe, the impacts of the climate crisis, floods, wildfires, droughts and rising seas are intensifying, seen most violently recently in Valencia. Meanwhile, major fossil fuel producing countries are on track to produce 110% more fossil fuels by 2030 than are compatible with the 1.5-degree global heating limit that is critical to safeguarding our future. COP29 is the moment for decisive action, and throughout these 2 weeks, we've had the opportunity to address the climate crisis by tackling the greatest barrier to that transition, which of course is finance. But as we approach the final hours of this conference, we're witnessing a lack of clear commitments and political will to do so. This morning, we're here to do two things. Firstly, to speak on the state of the COP29 proceedings, which so far have fallen very short of the ambition and accountability the world so desperately needs. And secondly, to launch an open letter signed by over 100 like-minded climate champions, including actors, influencers, writers, scientists, faith and youth leaders across the world, calling on leaders to formulate a comprehensive global plan to phase out fossil fuels and manage a just and equitable transition to clean, renewable energy. I'll now hand over to our panelists who will be sharing more what is at stake for our communities and expectations that they have for the final moments of this conference. First in line, Harjeet Singh.
Thank you, Tom. Friends, this is the last official day, and we are seeing a deadlock and deep divisions among parties. We are frustrated, we are angry, and we are exhausted by the decades of game being played by developed countries. We know that their priority is profits, profits, and more profits. And that's what they want to do here. For them, climate action is nothing but a business opportunity. This COP is supposed to be a finance COP. And you know the purpose is to come up with a new collective, quantified goal. And you know what is missing right now is quantum, because developed countries do not want to talk about the quantum of finance. Despite knowing that without agreeing on the scale of finance, we will not be able to deal with the climate crisis. We will not be able to transition away from fossil fuels. Developing countries will not be able to change their trajectory of emissions and come up with a different energy mix that they currently have. They will have to shift their economies. They will have to reskill their people. They will have to create green jobs, and that cannot happen without adequate finance. They know it. Back home, when they come up with policies, they do exactly that. But when we ask them to do the same thing at the global level because they are obligated to provide finance, they go round and round and round, but don't talk about money. Instead, they are pressing developing countries to agree to mitigation targets without giving them any assurance of money. And this is not a new conversation. I must remind you that the discussion to agree on a new collective quantified goal started 3 years ago. Numerous conversations and meetings and high-level discussions. We have not yet agreed on the quantum. Today is the last day of COP29. It's betrayal. It's negotiating in bad faith, and that's what we are seeing from developed countries. and they cannot shy away from their responsibility. They are the ones who are historically responsible for the crisis. They are obligated to provide money. The convention talked about it. The Paris Agreement is absolutely clear that it's developed countries who have to take the lead and provide finance, yet they are not meeting their obligation. And we cannot leave Baku without agreeing on a goal that's going to help developing countries transition away from fossil fuels, because we know it's fossil fuels that has caused the climate crisis. And we know developing countries are ready and willing to move away from fossil fuels. They have put far more ambitious plans on the table than developed countries. It's developed countries who are responsible for much more fossil fuel expansion than developing countries, despite having least dependence on revenues coming from fossil fuels, because they have a vested interest. They want to protect the fossil fuel industry. They want to make money from this crisis. That's the reality. And that's the plain and simple fact. Rest everything that you are hearing, that developing countries are not willing to do more mitigation, it's a sham. It's a game being played by developed countries. It's a narrative that they want to promote, to blame developing countries and not take responsibility for the action. So here we are, it's the last day. Very clearly we are going to go into overtime. A few hours, a few days, we'll see what happens, but we should not leave Baku without having a strong new climate finance goal. And we need to fight back, and that's what we are doing right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Harjeet. Over to Thato Gabaitse.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for giving me this platform to echo the heart of African communities. Every single day, I am reminded of what is at stake. The millions of lives upended by climate impacts that grow fiercer each year. We are not just numbers on a page or abstract discussions in a conference room. We are watching fields wither under relentless drought year in, year out. Mothers and young girls walking longer distances each day to find water for their households. Families losing their homes and livelihoods to floods that sweep through their villages with little warning. For many in the global north, climate change might still feel like a distant threat, like a news headline, but for us, it is here and now. It is the child who can no longer go to school because her family must move after their crops failed. It is the woman who cannot access health care because her clinic was destroyed by a cyclone. It is the elderly who cannot rebuild their homes after the 5th flood in as many years, and simply because there aren't any resources available. Amidst this devastation, our people have been resilient, fighting to come together and to adapt, to fight back against the odds, and we are exhausted. We cannot do this alone. We need finance, not in the form of loans that deepen our debts. We need grants and just energy transition support that uplifts, empowers, and protects our livelihoods. Finance means the chance to adapt to rising temperatures by building climate-resilient crops. It means protecting children from hunger and disease by strengthening food and water systems. It means creating opportunities for women and youth who are leading on the front lines of the crisis to build a better future. The refusal of wealthy nations to commit to the new collective quantified goal is not just disappointing, it is a betrayal. A betrayal of the Paris Agreement's promise to leave no one behind. A betrayal of the principles of fairness and equity that this process is supposed to uphold. Without adequate finance, African countries cannot update their NDCs with ambition required to mitigate and adapt. The dreams of a just transition, one that provides opportunities for fossil fuel dependent workers, safeguards communities, and drive renewable energy growth becomes harder to achieve. And the mechanism for addressing the loss and damage under the WEM remains empty and ineffective, leaving families to rebuild alone after disasters that strip them of everything. We must break this cycle steeped in history, where for centuries African resources were extracted to build wealth in the global north, leaving behind underdevelopment and inequality. The lands that we depend on are seen for their critical minerals, and once again we are being exploited in the name of progress. We need a global financial system that prioritizes people over profit, that recognizes the unique vulnerabilities of the global south, that values justice over extraction. Developed countries have lost sight over what is at stake. If we fail to act, we are not just failing the global south, we are failing humanity. But if we act with urgency and boldness, we have the opportunity to right historic wrongs and to build a world that is fair, sustainable, and inclusive for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Thato. Passing over to Joseph Sikulu.
Thank you, Tom. These last hours of COP are always filled with so much emotion, so I'll try and get through this by reading this. And I just want to preface this by saying that I know we're still waiting to hear the outcomes of last night's bilaterals, and we left after AOS's coordination last night as confused as everybody else that things had stalled. And I know that meetings had been scheduled right into the late of last night, and people were even here up until 4 a.m. And so I just want to take some time to acknowledge and pay my respects to all of our negotiators and all of our delegates who have been up at all hours of the night just here, continuing to hold the line and continuing to fight. Yesterday's text was like a X marks the spot thing, a map with no clear direction, a game where the goalposts are hidden or constantly moved. And that's weird analogies to be bringing into here, but the sad reality is that's what's happening. Year after year, our people come here and dance this dance and play this game. No one actually comes here out of excitement. We come because we have no choice, because we cannot let this process fail, but it does. When presidencies play games with our dignity, with our future, and with this process. 1,773 fossil fuel lobbyists this year, 2,456 last year. In comparison to the proportion of our negotiators is sometimes 10 to 1. So how can we expect to achieve the ambition that is needed to keep us on a pathway to 1.5 when the odds are always stacked against us? We hope to see in a draft text yesterday that would show the rich nations putting their money where their mouth is and responding to the demands from the global south. What we got is a text with no clear figure, no clear ground-based core money. But our message here has always been clear. Nothing less than $1 trillion in grants per year will be enough to see those most impacted by climate change on a just transition towards a safe and equitable future. Rich countries must stop stalling and start delivering. And this is not charity we're asking for, it's time for them to pay their debt. And I know we live in a world where the cost of living is skyrocketing, where people are struggling to put food on the table. That's the reality in our region too. But you know who isn't? Billionaires. The fossil fuel industry, the people in governments who hoard wealth and profit off the fossil fuel industry, who benefit off fossil fuel subsidies, who keep breaking record profits, who continue to stall these negotiations. Don't tell us the money isn't there. We know it is. We just lack the political will to get it. The new climate finance goal isn't just an arbitrary number for us, it's a lifeline for climate vulnerable nations like mine that are literally drowning due to a crisis we did not create. But despite it all, we're here to fight. And rich nations need to start doing the same. Commit to the rapid phase out of fossil fuels agreed upon at last year's climate talks in Dubai. We cannot afford to ignore the root cause of the climate crisis, which is our addiction to fossil fuels. The expansion and export of fossil fuels is the expansion and export of destruction to our islands, and we have no more time to delay. As we come to a close of this year's summit, we need to see strong financial commitments, also paired with ambitious goals to transition to a renewable economy. As we look forward to the year ahead, we need to see the road to 1.5 being kept alive through strong, ambitious NDCs and a clear commitment to phase out of fossil fuels. We're tired, but we are here to hold the line, and we are holding the line on hope because we have no choice but to. We just hope everybody's there with us.
Thank you, Joseph. Passing to Ayshka Najib.
Thank you so much, Tom. And since this is the last and final day of COP, I'm going to cut through the diplomacy and get right into the truth. This COP has a clear lack of political will. Yesterday, myself and my comrades stayed back until 2 a.m. following the Just Transition negotiations. And let me tell you, zero substantial progress has been made. To be honest, they're approaching a strategy of take it or leave it. We're not even witnessing negotiations happening in the room. What we're witnessing is procedural injustices. As you have heard a lot from my fellow panelists, the message is clear. The time for incremental action is over. We need bold, coordinated efforts that prioritize justice and the voices of frontline communities. In line with that, we are launching an open letter to global leaders this morning, signed by hundreds of climate champions, among them renowned actors, writers, scientists, academics, youth, and leaders, as well as civil society leaders. The letter we are launching today is a rallying cry for governments to step up and chart a new course for a safer future. I will now read the letter. Dear world leaders, we are not where we need to be. Scientists have issued a stark warning for decades. Extracting fossil fuels threatens everything we love. Communities across the globe are already experiencing the harsh realities of this crisis. And it's not just a climate crisis. Fossil fuel air pollution is responsible for 1 in 5 deaths worldwide. The thirst for oil has sparked and exacerbated conflicts for decades and crushed devastations to biodiversity across the globe. Yet, our global response remains dangerously inadequate. Year after year, governments have met at the UN climate talks to negotiate crucial frameworks to address this crisis. The most important being the Paris Agreement, under which the world has agreed to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But that threshold is very close to being broken, largely because we currently have no global plan to phase out of fossil fuels fast and fairly. Governments can claim to be climate leaders but approve vast waves of new coal, oil, and gas projects, because the Paris Agreement does not mention these words once. We're on track to extract 110% more oil, gas, and coal by 2030 than we could burn and stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Enough is enough. What we build today will be what we use tomorrow. We must stop expanding the problem. We are joining forces today to call on governments to chart a new course for a safer future. We welcome the leadership of 14 nations spearheading the push to negotiate a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, and we call on other countries to join them. A fossil fuel treaty is the missing piece of the puzzle, a framework to end the expansion of coal, oil, and gas, and manage and finance a fast and fair transition away from fossil fuels, to build a justice-centered, high-ambition international coalition of nation-states ready to lead the transition, who negotiate a treaty that is not consensus-based, meaning no country can block others pushing to phase out of fossil fuels. Throughout history, governments had the courage to forge treaties that banned nuclear weapons, phased out landmines, and saved the ozone. Now, we must do so again and come together to protect that what we love from the threat of fossil fuels. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ayshka. And just a reminder that that letter was embargoed until this press conference and is now available on the fossilfueltreaty.org website. We've got 9 minutes left. We'll take questions. I'd like to give preference to journalists in the room first, please. And also a reminder to introduce yourself and who you're with. Thank you.
Yep, my name is Megan Rowling. I work for Climate Home News. Couple of questions. Ayshka, you mentioned the Just Transition Work Programme negotiations being in a dire state. Can you explain a little bit what's going on there and why we might end up with a take it or leave it situation when obviously it's something that's very important for ordinary people who are affected by the transition? And then a question for Harjeet, maybe. You said we shouldn't leave here without a strong climate finance goal. And we have this problem of different expectations in terms of the numbers. In the text yesterday, I mean, I think it's been in previous texts as well, there's an option at the end for a review of the NCQG that could be, say, reviewed in like 5 years' time, or whenever parties agree, it might be reviewed in order to, for example, I don't know, increase it, or at least that this would not be set in stone what we get out of here for the next 10 years. So I'm just wondering what your view is on that potential review process and whether that's acceptable, whether it would be useful. Thank you.
I can go first on the Just Transition Work Programme. The issue is very clear. The COP29 presidency is unwilling to open the text for negotiations. And right now, our push is to make sure that we give enough time for parties to actually negotiate. So in the negotiations room, what we're witnessing is parties giving statements on their red lines over and over again, but without substantially engaging on the text that is in front of our eyes. We're waiting for a new iteration, but then the message that has been given by the presidency is a take it or leave it approach of that iteration without any space to substantially engage on the text. This is the clear demand from the rights-based constituencies.
Thank you, Ayshka. Just to add that developing countries have been extremely accommodating, and when they have to shift their economies and energy systems, they need a plan, they need a framework. And the fact is, when they are demanding for that framework, many countries are resisting that. So developed countries don't want a specific discussion on the framework that is required to help developing countries make that transition in a planned manner, because we did commit to an orderly and just transition. And to make it orderly, you need to have a plan. And the reality is that EU, US, Canada are opposing that framework. And without that, we will not be able to achieve it. And because that requires a range of actions that need to be taken and, of course, backed by finance. Now, coming to the next point on the review part. I think what we are asking for is, yes, we need a review after 5 years because the needs are evolving. And there's already an agreement that climate finance has to be provided in a manner that we respond to the evolving needs. And that is going to be absolutely fundamental. But I must also underline the fact that we cannot expect that money is going to be ratcheted up slowly between now and the next few years. The 100 billion target that was agreed several years ago, we knew that it was going to be insufficient. Let's look at where we are when it comes to climate action. Emissions are rising. Temperatures are rising. We have not been able to protect people from disasters, and we have not even provided sufficient resources to communities who are already facing climate impacts. The cost of inaction is way higher. We know that, and the recent independent high-level expert group report made it very clear that it's going to be multiple times of what we need to put money now in terms of climate action. So we need trillions of dollars now across the entire range of climate action, moving away from fossil fuels, helping people adapt, and also helping people recover from climate impacts. If we don't act now, the cost is going to multiply so much that we all will not be able to afford. I think that's extremely important. And that's why review becomes also important, to make sure to check where we are and how do we respond to the evolving needs.
I think there was a question here in the front.
Ariel from Energy Intelligence. I have a question on countries pushing back against the transition away from fossil fuels. You mentioned developed countries, but we've also heard that at the G20, for instance, there was a pushback from India and Saudi Arabia. And I'm wondering whether you can comment on whether oil producers, gas producers are pushing back, and where Azerbaijan stands on this as well. Thank you.
We need to look at who is pushing back and for what reason, and that requires a bit of nuance. When we hear Bolivia or India or some other members of G20 group pushing back, the reason is that the task that they have to undertake as part of transition is massive, and they have not been provided sufficient resource. And there is a sequencing problem. Developed countries want these large economies to make a transition without any commitment of finance. But Saudi Arabia cannot be compared with other countries. They have money, they have the technical know-how to move away from transition, and Saudi Arabia cannot use it as an excuse that they need money to make that transition. So yes, they're part of G20, but their approach and their reason is very different from Bolivia or India or Indonesia. I think that is something that we need to understand.
Open the floor for questions from NGOs as well.
I'm just wondering how you feel about the role of the presidency here in terms of representing the most vulnerable communities. Do you feel that the presidency has done a good job on that so far and has their interests at heart? And also on the global plan to phase out fossil fuels that you're talking about. I know that the Non-Proliferation Treaty has been going on for some time now, but I'm just wondering if that were not to happen, or is there an option, for example, within these talks to be able to come up with some kind of just transition plan at the global level for the transition away from fossil fuels that might make the implementation of that transition a bit easier?
I'm not sure we'll be able to cover all that in 20 seconds, but maybe you want to take the first half, Joseph, on presidency's response to climate vulnerable countries.
Oh, sure, because you can answer that in 2 seconds, because the answer is no. And I'm not just going to say that about this year. It's also presidency that we saw in the previous year as well. These same kind of stalling tactics aren't helpful towards the negotiations, nor is it creating space for us to be able to go in there and negotiate on these texts that are so important. And I think what's missing is this idea of what values are supposed to be grounded within these processes, because there aren't any, and we don't see that. And we see that most of our vulnerable communities, even Indigenous people, continue to be sidelined within these. And the worry is that we have now a standard that was set last year where these stalling tactics were used, the same this year. Will it be the same next year too? Is it going to be a troika of presidencies that are stalling us or stalling action? And we hope that over the next year we see more leadership for Indigenous people, bringing these values into the negotiations and hoping that they ground that in these next presidencies.
Thanks. Thanks for the questions, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, and we'll be outside available. Thank you.